in past 4 years. Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you, Caroline. I think you, yeah, that was a good brief introduction to me, and I won't say a lot more about me, but I do want to say a couple of things. So, you're right. I was on staff actually from 1988 to 2015, and as I think we might have mentioned when a few people were on before the rest of you came, for any of those of you who knew me before I retired, you might not recognize me now. So I just wanted to say I did stop coloring my hair when I retired. So now you're seeing the real natural color. Back to that. And Caroline mentioned during the pandemic, I had, she called it unicorn hair. My grandkids call it rainbow hair. Lots of bright colors.
Pink, blue, aqua.
Yeah, lots of hot pink and lime, and yeah. So because I was at the DRC so long, I'm often considered the one to have some of the historical memory for the DRC. And that's accurate in some ways, but memory is a little bit deceptive because it comes and goes, you know. So I did go back to I keep all my old calendars, and then I could see what was happening when. And luckily, in the early 90s sometime, I started color coding it. So I didn't have to read everything. I could read the color that was the DRC things, which was most of it because I worked, you know, a lot. Also, though, my memories and my calendar are kind of training focused. So what I remember and know about the programs are somewhat based on what was happening in training, which they reflected what was important and what was emphasized in the programs. But so I want to do a little bit, some people didn't get to introduce themselves, and I'm not going to go back to those introductions, but I thought it might be fun and useful to see among those who are here that I know and don't know, what era you kind of came into the DRC in, just when you first started. So if you think about that, I'm going to go through, I'm going to say the director, and most of you probably knew who the executive director was when you started, but sometimes more prominent than that for you would be staff members, and especially the program managers who managed the volunteers on the floor while the directors were fundraising and doing other things. So I want to see if there's, Jim Metz was the founding director, and he was here from 1987 when we opened the DRC to 2000. And the first year with him, the staff were Dawn Einwalter and myself. Was anybody here? Raise your hand if you were here. Oh, there are a lot of people, I don't see their faces anyway, but because you're not there, but raise your hand if you were there when Dawn Einwalter and Jim Metz and I were the staff. Nobody that, yeah, I think of the people here, Robbie might be the one who's the oldest. So let's skip down. Then the next director, the next program manager under Jim Metz was Ann Mcbroom. Any of you there with Ann Mcbroom? She started in 1989 and retired in 96, or left the DRC in 96. And Mater worked with her a lot. Nobody remembers that. Okay. Then Beth McCarthy. Yeah.
Sorry, I do.
Oh, your hand. I see. I'm looking for actual physical hands. Okay. So Beth.
I'm dating myself.
Ann was here. That was you. Okay, great. And then Beth McCrary was the program manager for a couple of years, 96 to 98. And then Stephanie Bell was also a couple of years, 98 to 2000. Well, I think she was a little more memorable. She had more impact on the agency probably than just those 2 years sound like. Anybody in here with Stephanie? Oh, Robbie. Okay. Did you start when Stephanie was program manager?
I believe I may have, but I remember when Jim Metz was executive director, you just bundled him in, so I didn't know.
Yeah, he was the executive director when
Right.
Stephanie was the last program manager under Jim Metz.
You were on
So
Third Avenue or something.
Yeah, or maybe even Beth McCrary might have been. Okay. And then the next executive director was Tony Hazapas. And the program manager under him, he was there from 2000 to 2003. And Kristen Fontaine was the program manager. She had been the assistant to Beth and Stephanie. but she became the program manager, I think 2000 to 2002. Anybody else here in that, remember that? Or then we had a team of program managers, Megan Stein and Andrea, Andrea's name was Friedman and then Danon, Andrea Friedman or Andrea Danon. Any of you, Robbie remembers all of these now because you're on. Anybody else come in at that time? Okay, then Patty Dudley was executive director from 2004 to 13. And later I'll go through, oh, here we're seeing lots of people. So you might have been, Stephanie Rogers was the program manager from 2004 to 2008. I saw several hands under Patty Dudley. So it might've been with Stephanie Rogers was managing the, mostly conciliators then. And then Brooke Gilder from 2008 to 2010. And then Patty Dinsmore, who had been active as a volunteer and had managed the courts and had other roles, became the program services, mediation and program services, I think, manager or director in 2010 and continued until after I left. And Laura Fleischer or Laura Pace, changed names too, was there then. Well, I'm seeing more hands. Okay. And then, so let's see, Sue, and yeah, okay, great. And then Ray Levine was interim director after Patty Dudley left for most of a year, 2013, when Terry Randall was hired. She came on at the end of 2013 and was there until after I left in 2016. So did any of you start when Terry Randall was the director? I see some hands that are up, but I think those are up from before. I don't know if you know how to take the
I
hand.
was here.
Pardon?
Seeing them. I was here under Terry.
Okay,
Yes, I remember Terry.
Yvonne
Okay.
had her hand up.
Yeah, Yvonne.
okay,
Yes.
okay. And then since then, we had, of course, Patty Dinsmore has been executive director and interim director off and on for a couple of different times. Some of you might have even started when she was in that role. Leanne did, and Michelle, okay. And then we had Dan for a few months, a little less than a year, I think. And then Dave now. So did any of you start as recently as, I think Dave started in 2021, right? Some of you came back. Okay. Well, that's helpful to me to see. We've got a pretty good range of people coming in at different times. So I'm going to go back to the ancient history of how the DRC started, which some of you have probably heard this before, but the DRC was started by a task force of the King County Bar Association. So and mediation wasn't new in this area. Snohomish County DRC had been going for a while. In San Francisco, the San Francisco community boards were very well known, and those two used very different models. So this task force studied models around the country, and then they created a board, a community-based board. And I think the DRC incorporated in 1987, or maybe even 86, because in 87, we actually opened our doors to the community. And what we were very mediation focused. We were in the Pilgrim Congregational Church. So the board had hired Jim Metz to be the first director, and he got donated space in the Pilgrim Congregational Church. And so we were there from 1988 till the early 90s. And they did a mediation training before, I should say we, because I was, as I said, a founding member. I was active as a volunteer then. And we did a mediation training for new mediators, but really we relied on this cadre of experienced mediators. And I was one of them, and I was probably the least experienced of those mediators because the others had private practices, some for years. Some did family mediation, a wide variety. Most of them did family mediation in private practice and other kinds of community mediation. And so we could offer all kinds of mediation services, including family, without doing any training ourselves. And most of our volunteers, even after that for several years, came from other mediation programs. we didn't do our own mediation training until quite a bit later, except for that first initial one. So, and part of our, I should go back and say that this organization that the board formed was a membership organization. And that means that it had an elected board, and we had an annual meeting, and every year we elected the board members. Or they had probably 2 or 3 year terms, but we elected any that needed to be replaced. Anybody who was a member of that membership organization, the DRC. And we scheduled mediations all around the county. Very unlike now. I mean, we found always donated space. We didn't pay for space, but in community centers and churches and all around King County. And the focus was mediation. So we had some of these mediators who were the mentors who went in to answer the phones. When people called in, they were going to be the ones who would, you know, set up the mediations. And we expected people to call in saying, I would like to schedule a mediation. These mediators weren't trained in what conciliators do on the phones nowadays, case management or conciliators, we call them that. They just expected people to, they were just going to get a little bit of background and sign them up for a time. But people didn't call in saying, I want a mediation. They called in saying, I have a problem. And they complained about it. And can you fix this for me? So we gradually, I was one of those first volunteers, and we gradually developed a conciliation model for how to process calls that were coming in and the way they were coming in. And still, from initially for that first year at least, those people handling all the intake calls were people who were already mediators. We were really reliant on volunteers. It was a really volunteer focused program, even after the first couple of us were hired as staff. We had annual events for volunteers, recognition events, and we really wanted to offer opportunities for people who are volunteering to develop their skills and have different kinds of experiences. Let's see here. So, and then after the first year, Dawn Einwalter, who was the program manager, left, and Ann Mcbroom was hired, and she stayed on for several years. And even though most of our funding came from small claims court funds, which was Jim Metz had been involved in developing the state legislation to permit counties to put a surcharge on the filing fees so they could fund dispute resolution centers. And I'm not going to focus much on the funding because at the time I pretty much knew what was going on, but it didn't, I don't retain a lot of the details of that. But we weren't required to have a small claims court program. That funding was from small claims court, but it was for our program in general, with the, I guess, theory that if we handled cases, there would be fewer people who would need to go to small claims court. We would take some load off small claims courts. But by 1991, we developed a pilot program in the small claims court program to start doing mediations at court. And also, because we had this new conciliation model, we started developing conciliation training. And that was after the first year. In the first year, I was doing outreach. I wasn't in training. We didn't do any training in the first year. We had these experienced mediators, and I was trying to get cases. So I was out in the community trying to get cases and also additional volunteers, but really focused on building up the cases. And in the second year, I switched to being training person. So we developed this conciliation training, and we offered it 3 to 5 times a year, that training. And Ann Mcbroom pretty much handled the practicum. It was very informal, as somebody mentioned, maybe Becky mentioned. It seems to me it was like, observe some mentors for a while, and when you feel like you're ready, you can co-mediate for a while. And if that goes okay and you want to try it on your own, you can do that. It was very flexible and informal. And it gradually became more formalized and more structured, not only because of what we saw that worked, but because of like Washington Mediation Association and Resolution Washington. They developed standards, and we were part of working on that. And these standards, to make it more uniform across the state, we had standards that we wanted to meet the same standards the other DRCs were meeting. And about then, in the early 90s, we moved to the Trianon building down in Belltown. And the first few years till I think 96, we were at, if any of you remember this, there was an entrance, it was at 3rd and Wall, and there was an entrance on Wall Street. And we had space that went off Wall Street. Were you there and then, Robbie, off Wall Street, that entrance? And we developed, as I said, my recollections mostly about the training. We developed more training for our group of mediators and conciliators. So we had a lot of continuing education. And we had a kind of rotation to cover the kinds of cases we did. So we had, you know, a landlord-tenant in service, and we alternated between an attorney who was an attorney for landlords and one who was with legal services for tenants. And we had mobile home park in services. We had a lot of mobile home park cases in those days because mobile home parks were required by state law to negotiate, mediate really, with tenants if they wanted to evict them. And we had ones on things like writing durable agreements and intercultural factors that come up in mediation. And we had some fun things like we developed a DRC Jeopardy game. Any of you remember that? We had, you know, categories and points, and we had whoever was coming for the in-service would be put on teams and compete. And we increased those, and we had some peer consultations where people just talked about case consultations. We had, over the years, it kept increasing those. And at one point we were offering about 8 in-services a month. We would have some in the daytime, some in the evening, you know, a couple a week on average. And we also had big mailing parties because we had to send out information about these in-services to all of our volunteers. And this was before, it wasn't before computers, it was before the DRC had any computers. We were not computerized for the first, until about 2000. And so we did bulk mailings. Even if we'd been computerized in those days, not everybody had email. So we sent out bulk mailings and had huge parties, you know, at least once a month. And there were also some major focuses on facilitation. Jim Metz, the director, was not a mediator, and he never claimed to be, but he did facilitate large group things a lot. And he and I actually facilitated for about maybe over a year, the Pike Place Market Roundtable, which was an association of vendors and administration at the Pike Place Market and the nonprofit agencies that had services there. And every month they met to try to hash out some of the issues. And we were the facilitators for that. And I remember one of the first issues, it was real learning for me in terms of facilitation. One of the first issues, they wanted to decide, should we make decisions by voting or by consensus? So the root question at that point was, how do we make a decision about how we're going to make decisions? Are we going to make the decision of whether to have it by voting or consensus? Are we going to make that decision by voting or by consensus? So you can see the circle you can get into with this kind of issue. And also, that was Norm Rice was elected mayor at I think 89. So in 1990, he set up these education summits, big meeting to talk about education issues. And we provided a lot of the facilitators and trained facilitators for that. So that was a big focus for us. And because we were doing these facilitations and we wanted to give our mediators opportunities to do things that were different than what they already did, we offered a large group facilitation training. and a kind of practicum to go with that. In 1991, we brought in outside people, but over all the years since I was there, we struggled with the question of how can we offer facilitation services. I think partly because there are so many different kinds of facilitation. There might be a large group where it's a very heated, a big issue that's come up in the community. Something has happened that's major that has people upset. And it can be all the way to a small group facilitation of somebody's staff retreat. There's so many different kinds, whether there's conflict invested or whether they're more routine, whether they're just looking for team building and how large, and if you have control over who's coming or if it's an open public meeting, so many different aspects. So we continue to struggle with that and go to different kinds of trainings for different kinds of facilitation. But we never, I hope that's something the DRC, there's something for you to work on in the future, coming up with the models for, maybe even the model for how you decide, in this case, what kind of facilitation you're going to use and have people who can do that. Okay, then moving on, in 1996, we moved the office within the Trianon building to the office that had an entrance on 3rd Avenue. And this was, Jim Metz was still the director, and Beth McCrary was the program manager for a couple of years, then Stephanie Bell for a couple of years. And we kept adding new in-service topics because of the kinds of cases we had. Auto repairs, we were doing a lot of auto repair cases. Later, we did a lot of condo management, condo board cases. We offered some culture specific training. I had a special focus myself in intercultural factors. But I believed more in offering culture general. I didn't like the idea of you say, in this culture, do this, don't do this, that kind of pat answers for intercultural training. But we developed a way to offer intercultural training, which our mediators were asking for. By an example would be if we're doing African-American intercultural training, we brought in a lot of African-Americans. We talked to them about what kinds of situations they experienced where there was miscommunication or conflict with people from the dominant culture or other cultural groups. And then we did scenarios, and in the in-service, we'd have scenarios where, what do you think's going on here? We'd do a little skit kind of an interaction and say, okay, stop, what do you think's going on? And we would hear from our mediators and conciliators who are primarily white, and we'd hear from the group that we brought in of people of color who, from the culture we're talking about, would talk about how they saw it. And so it was an exchange of ways of looking at and interpreting particular interactions. And that seemed to work pretty well. And we had them on lots of different cultures and brought in sometimes one or two people, sometimes a whole group of people to do that. One major development during this time for me, really had a major impact on my career, was there's an organization you may be familiar with, NAFCM, North American, what's it stand for? NAFCM, North American, maybe it's not. It's something about community mediation. Anyway, the last two, CM is community mediation. Now I'm forgetting what they all stand for. It's an nationwide association, as it's North American because it includes Canada, association of community mediation centers. And they got some contracts that then they, shared out regional in the different regions to their member associations, community centers. And they did AmeriCorps trainings. They developed a whole series of AmeriCorps trainings. It was not to teach AmeriCorps trainees how to be mediators, but how to resolve conflict. So it was conflict resolution skills. And we did many gigs through that and went around. I stayed in King County unless often people came to me, AmeriCorps groups, asking if it was in Snohomish County, I would check with the Snohomish County DRC. And they said, we're not really doing that, so that's fine if you do it, that kind of thing. Then they put out a competitive bid in 1997. AmeriCorps didn't want to train all their trainees, it was too expensive. These were contract trainings we're getting paid for. It was getting too expensive, so they wanted to switch it to training their staff members who would then train the trainees. But we knew this was going to be hard because the staff members wouldn't have a background in mediation or anything. But NAFCM put out a competitive bid. They were going to have a team in each of the 5 regions, the way they broke the US down as 5 regions. So we won the competitive bid for our region. And I developed the proposal. But Julia Gold from the UW, their mediation program, the law school's mediation program, was a collaborator on that. So we got this for our area, which included the whole Pacific coast and probably included Hawaii. I never got to go to Hawaii for that. Anyway, so I was part of a design team, one person from each of the regions. So 5 of us went to New Orleans to develop the curriculum for how we're going to do a 3-day training of presenters. And that team that I worked with in New Orleans was the most collaborative, best experience I had through my whole career, and really influenced, I think, the way I worked. And then when I came back, Julia and I did trainings all over with Oakland and Sacramento and LA and in Portland and in Washington and Seattle and Tacoma. For a couple of years, we did these trainings all around. And the design team got together periodically and had little reunions and revamped our materials. So that was a major development, 1997 to about 2000. And then also in the conciliation training, we had expanded it we started at maybe 16 hours up to a 24-hour training. We developed a very thorough and big manual for trainers to use with alternate exercises they could use for different purposes with different objectives. And we also developed a training we called Project Resolve. It was a conflict resolution skills training, but we focused and offered it to inmates in some women's prisons, in ones who were in it could be in the jail or prison. And we offered that a number of places. And these people were people who chose, some had work release, so they actually came to our site, and they were people who were allowed to leave the facility in King County. Others, we went into the prison. And the ones who were allowed to leave were choosing to give up a day that they could have spent with their family or someone else. So they were very motivated, and it was a really great experience. I should be doing the time check. Okay. So moving on. We finally, in about 2000, were computerized. And this was also about the time Jim Metz left. That is a little bit indicative. He was very computer averse. And Tony Hazapas came on. And Kristen Fontaine was the program manager. She had been tinkering with, I don't know, we got a computer somewhere. And she had been developing a program and patching it together to use for recording case stuff. But we finally really went in full-fledged and got computerized and started using it the way most people had been using it for the last 10 or 15 years. And our court program was increasing. It was expanding. It had started as a pilot program, and it expanded in going to all the courts. I think at that time there were about 12. They later consolidated some of them, and covering all the calendars and really having more people prepared to do that. And the practicum was becoming increasingly formalized, and it became part of the training program. It had been just separate. It was more like just a mediation offshoot before that. But when we had, and looking at my calendar, it was like full of meetings to interview people, to observe people, to watch them do mocks and observe them in the field. And as I said, we were doing these all around the county. So when I went to observe somebody, it was out in the boondocks sometimes. Yeah, I mean, to me, the boondocks, Kent or Auburn or Renton. Where did I go to see you, Robbie? It was someplace like that, wasn't it? In the south end, I think.
It was Kent.
Yeah. I have a picture of that in my mind still. He did a great job. He said it went badly, but he did a great job. I could see he was good. So, and gradually we reduced the number of in-services. I mean, it was a matter of staff resources. We had about usually 2 or 3 in-services a month, then I'd say. And we were increasing the contract trainings we're doing, both for generating revenue, but also for professional development for our volunteers who wanted to, a lot of them wanted to get into training, excuse me. And we did some large ones for like the Ombuds Office, King County Ombuds Office. We did trainings for them, all in conflict resolution skills and somewhat media. They were in the role of more like mediators. They were neutrals. And the Seattle Office for Civil Rights, we did training for them, and Lehigh Low Income Housing Institute and El Centro. So we did trainings for a lot of different groups. You know, they might be 1 or 2 days or even short trainings. And we had some major ones. I was doing a lot of volunteer training with my church, Community of Christ, which has their own whole series of conflict resolution skills training. They have something that's very like our conflict resolution skills for work at home at the DRC for people who aren't going to be mediators, just we call it interpersonal peacemaking. And one listening year, which was a lot like conciliation training. So I've been doing a lot of volunteer work for them, but they wanted me to do more. They would have taken up every weekend I had. And so we negotiated and saw that there could be a win-win-win. I mean, they could get some of my time, the church, and they were at that point wanting to pay me because they knew I couldn't volunteer that much time. They wanted to pay me, and the DRC could get some income from them to release me to do some trainings. And the best win for me was I couldn't work all week and do training every weekend. So when I did trainings for them, because it was on a contract with the DRC, then I got some time off to make up for that. So the DRC got the money and I got time off. And the church got people trained. And a lot of our volunteers got to co-train with me, or even 2 of them might do it after they've done it a couple times without me. So it gave more opportunities for more people. And we continued to do, we did trainings for them. We also did mediation. I did some mediations for them and facilitations. And some of our experienced mediators got to, church mediations are hard. They're very much sort of like family, especially in my church, which is very small. So it was around, there was some around the country, the trainings, but mostly it was in the Pacific Northwest. And then in 2001, I was at the DRC when the major earthquake struck, February 28th. I don't know if you remember where you were, but I hid under the I ducked under the big conference table. Some of you remember that really heavy, thick, big conference table we had in the old days in our training room. And then in that summer, 2001, we had our first intern. And it wasn't for training, it was for program generally. And that was Nicole Conforto. And she, unlike I think all of the interns we had after that were law school students, mostly Seattle U, but some from UW. And I don't think we had any from Gonzaga, but there was a competitive thing every year where one of them got a paid internship, but we also had other ones that we paid, I think. But that year, Nicole Conforto, she had just finished her freshman year of college. And she set a high bar for all these law school interns we got later on. She was fantastic. She connected with us because her grandmother, Peggy Vincent, had been a long-term mediator with us, one of our mentors and family mediator, and mediation too. And at the end of that summer, we moved to that office we had on Main Street in the International District. I remember we moved in right before 9/11 because I remember watching it on a little TV there. I mean, not the first hit I saw at home because it was early, but we watched it all day. And in response to that, we developed conversation cafes, or got involved in conversation cafes. And then once we were in that office, we also had, that's when Megan Stein and Andrea Friedman or Andrea Danon were co-program directors, still with Tony Hazapis as the director. And in 2003, the organization changed from being a membership organization. So now the board was, and I think, as far as I know, still is, was until I left at least, a self-generating board. And there was no membership meeting and no. And in those days, we regularly offered the basic mediation training. We had started up, for many years, we didn't offer it. Our volunteers came from other trainings. Sometimes they did the practicum with us. And then Anne Mcbroom and Mater Foreman and Donna Morse had a business, Counterpoint Associates, that offered mediation training. And they kind of formed it because Jim Metz didn't want to offer mediation training. He felt like we were going to oversupply the mediation field. So they offered it so our volunteers could get mediation training. And then we gradually took that on and started regularly offering the basic mediation training, probably 2 or 3 times a year. And conciliation training, we still did 2 or 3 times a year. And then we had court conciliation training a couple times a year. And we started doing family mediation training once a year. And developed these community workshops like conflict resolution skills for work and home, which is a 12-hour, what it could be, the modules could be reformed into different lengths, but typically 12-hour training that we offer to the community 4 or 5 times a year. And we also use the same model, but focused on landlords and dealing with difficult situations with tenants, and to offer that usually a couple times a year. And we had some major contracts. Besides the Community of Christ contract for training, we did, we applied on a competitive RFP kind of thing for King County. They had all these different trainings they offer for their staff in conflict resolution, communication skills, that kind of thing, a lot of different titles. And we applied for that, and for, I'd say a couple of 2004 through 2006, we did over each year we do maybe 14 or 15 full day trainings for them. Maybe 8 different trainings. Some would be 2 days, some would be 1 day. And also did some training for other groups like Bicycle Alliance and a lot of different housing and shelter organizations. So we were doing a lot of training. I not only wasn't solo on staff, I was most of the time, but then Megan Stein was part-time doing training with me. Meg, at some points, Mako Blosser was, but I always had this large cadre of volunteers who began doing training and did it as, we paid them. They were contract trainers. We paid them our low nonprofit rates, but so many people, one of the problems I had in going back and thinking who was on staff when, was that so many of our staff were volunteers, became contract trainers, or did some contract work, became staff, went back to being volunteers. They fluctuated back and forth. So looking at my calendar, I couldn't even tell if they were, what role they were in necessarily. And then in the middle of 2004, after Tony Hazapas had left, and we kind of, the staff just kind of covered, we didn't really have an interim director, we kind of all managed it together. He left at the end of 2003, I guess. And the hiring process took a while, and Patty Dudley was hired in mid 2004, and she stayed till 2013. So Stephanie Rogers was the program manager under her first till 2008. We moved to the Good Shepherd Center in 2006, and they're still there. So that was a big move. And when we got there, they had this lovely ground. So we, besides doing annual volunteer recognition events, we had picnics in the summer, volunteer picnics. And then we graduated, at some point in there, we shifted from having volunteer conciliators to having staff hired to do conciliation, or the case management. The jargon changed too from conciliation to case managers. And that made a big impact on the practicum, because that had been great training through the practicum, but the administrators felt that it would be more, I guess Patty Dudley and some others felt it would be more stability for the first contact with clients to have a staff person who could carry it all the way through. How many of you have heard of collaborative law? People involved in collaborative law, we mostly work with ones doing it for family mediation or family cases. It's not mediation. The lawyers represent their clients, and they bring in other neutral people, and they behave in a non-adversarial role. So they had requirements for training on things very much like mediation. Even though they represent their client, they also are trying to do it in a collaborative way. So we started doing major trainings, very similar to mediation training, but designed for collaborative law professionals, attorneys, and all the auxiliary people that they bring in had to take this kind of training. We also did a full mediation training for the Department of Neighborhoods, which was a real coup for us to get them to buy into training all their staff in mediation, so that they would have skills as they worked with people in the neighborhood. And they did a full, 40-hour training during the summer, and had some kind of, we set up a practicum so that they could have some experience working with mentors. Let's see. Now, Patty Dinsmore, you all, I'm sure know Patty Dinsmore. She had been a volunteer, and then in 2005 was hired on as staff, and she was hired to be the court coordinate all the small claims court leads. And then in 2006, I had so much training stuff going on, we decided that we would hire somebody to handle the practicum, to peel that off from the rest of what I was doing and have a practicum coordinator. So Patty applied for that. She was already on staff, so that was a little differently than we had seen it. She was already working full time, and we wanted a half-time person. But she convinced us that she would like to take it on. So she did. And so she took over all those observations I'd been doing in mock mediations and interviewing people and so on at each stage. And then in 2010, she was asked to develop the family mediation program further and took on a broader role. So she became the mediation and court services manager, covering court and mediation and the whole thing. But she hired help she hired Kevin at that point, and Laura. So Kevin took over some of the court coordination, and Laura Pace was the intake services coordinator. And as we developed the practicum to include the series of what we call theory to practice, training, the training staff handled that. I handled coordinating theory to practice, but she handled the rest of the mediation process. And so, as I said, her role was expanded because we wanted to beef up the family mediation program. And so she did that. We also shifted it because some of my time was freed up with the practicum. We did more major contracts, and one of the ones with a really big contract for us was with USPS, the Postal Service. And we did a 16-hour training for all of their managers and then 2-hour follow-up. Well, the Postal Service has a lot of managers, but in 2000, let's see, in 2000, I guess 2006, no, 2008, we offered we did it for 6 different groups, 2 days each, plus 2 hours of follow-up a month later, something like that. And we had plans for 2009 and 2010, all these rolling things of more training for them. And then the recession hit and they had to draw back. So that we really did it pretty full-fledged for a year. And then it became less. We still had lots of other contracts. We did contracts with Boeing for their managers at 3 different sites.
Hi,
And,
Suzanne.
pardon?
Sorry, excuse me. I just wanted to check and do a time check-in with you.
Yeah, oh, my, it's almost time.
Yeah.
So let me wrap up. Well, one other major thing I want to mention is we did the World Affairs Council would just come in, bringing people in, and we would do a little, not training, just a little presentation. It wasn't a training thing. But one of those that came in 2012 developed into us going to Mexico, to Guadalajara area, to do mediation training for police officers there. And we did a full week of mediation training in Mexico. And other sort of things that shifted were the focus on that came in, some of you are aware, foreclosure mediation, anti-harassment mediation. That was really a big program focus starting about the time Patty Dudley left, or maybe when she was still there. But Patty Dinsmore was in her role of mediation and court services. And so we did major focus on developing foreclosure mediation training and our mediator cadre. It really overwhelmed the DRC for a little while. But we also brought in, besides foreclosure, brought in other major professional development trainings, like, for our mediators and for mediators around the area, that we did things like crucial conversations, and Sam Imperati and Nina Meyerding, well-known people who we brought in for like full day trainings. And we also really developed a scholarship fund to enable people who are low income to attend our trainings, mediation training and community workshops and so on. It had a whole process with a committee that supervised that. And then after Patty Dudley left, we had the interim director, Ray, for about a year, or several months anyway. And then Terry Randall came in, and she was still there when I left. And you guys know the history after that, probably more. But Patty Dinsmore has been on and off, as she's come back a couple of times. Dan Johnston was there for a few months. And I'd say all of you who knew some of the directors, there are always pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses with any of the directors. So I don't want to say anything negative about any of them. But I think Dan Johnston did have a different vision for the DRC than what most of us who'd been volunteers and staff over the years had. And so he did leave pretty quickly. And now we have Dave Martin. And And I hear that there are like 22 or more staff, 22 plus court leads, maybe 28 staff members. So it is blossoming again. I'm so happy to hear it. And I'm sorry, I meant to leave time for more questions.
Well, let's open the floor up for those who have some time. It is after 1. If you do need to leave, we totally understand. But if you have some time and you want to ask Sue Ann some questions, Sue Ann, are you okay with that?
Yes, that's fine with me. I am sorry, I didn't think this would take that long.
No, I think we need a part 2. So don't worry about it. We're going to bring you back again, like in a month, to do part 2 and some more in depth, because I found this so valuable and I hope everyone else did. So let's open the floor for questions. Yvonne, I see your hand up.
Thank you. So Sue Ellen, thank you for that comprehensive history. And I am wondering, is there any particular type of training that you would have loved to have seen done during your time, that you would hope the DRC might move in that direction? Or was there anything that you did particularly in your time that you just feel should be amplified and continued?
Well, I think that I mentioned that struggle with facilitation. I think there's a great need for facilitation and facilitators, and mediators have the skills to do that. So a program that figures out how to develop that, I think could be very worthwhile. It's a challenge because, as I said, there's so many different types of facilitation. But I think that's an avenue to explore. Another thing, it's not a different type, but we used to offer more, a lot more in services for our conciliators and mediators. And I guess that's kind of been replaced by the fact that the practicum has a lot of, the theory to practice content specific sessions. And there were just the in services we offered it toward the end of when I was there anyway, were more focused on a specific type, like it might be an anti-harassment or a foreclosure in service or a family mediators in service. And maybe that meets the needs better than the more general ones. But, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I know something that I took away from this was that there's so many opportunities for mediation and conflict resolution to be applied in the world around us. I learned today of the USPS contract, and I'm like, whoa, that's awesome. Why didn't I get that invite, Sue Ann? I'm just going to talk about you. And then the churches, the work release, and your trip to Mexico. Caroline, you are slacking on your supervision.
Well, if anybody wants to try to revive the USPS, I still have the contact people, although they may have retired by now. But because they loved the program, they were so enthusiastic, and we had things lined up for the next year. And the main trainers were like Karen Zog, who's been gone a long time from this part of the country, and Colleen McCullough, who lives in Arizona now, and who did a lot of the trainings with Colleen? I have to think about that a minute. I know who else did this. I mean, lots of different people did them, but some did them a lot.
Did Sarah Bergdahl do some of that?
Sarah Bergdahl did some, and I think Sarah Knowles did some. Yeah, that's right.
Michelle.
Thank you. Sue Ann, I come from the world of fundraising, so I would love to hear more about the scholarship fund and how that came about and what the structure looked like, because we should be doing that again.
Yeah, we had a way that people could donate to the scholarship fund. And when I retired, actually, they renamed it. I didn't have a name before, but they renamed it the Sue Ann Allen Scholarship Fund. So I'd love it if it got my name back. But people donated to it. It was just an option. You could donate to most people, general funds or scholarship. And I recruited a lot of my friends donated to it. And we had a committee. Usually it had about 3 people on it. board or other active people who were interested in that. And there was an application deadline, like before a mediation training or another major kind of training, there'd be a deadline when you could apply for a scholarship. And so we got applications from people, and this committee reviewed them. And usually we offered people a combination of, in application form, which I might be able to find if I punched around in the DRC form someplace. There was an application form, and it asked how much they could contribute. It would combine what they could contribute, and we would ask them if they're willing to come in and do some work exchange. So there'd be a certain number of hours of work exchange, and then a part that was waived, it was paid for from the scholarship fund. So they usually got a combination package.
Nice, thank you.
And I think it really hit the dirt when the funding went down, and we really needed all the funding to go to general funds. Even when I contributed, it was after I retired, but contributed to the general fund instead of the scholarship fund because there was a desperate need for a while there.
I'm looking forward to bringing the scholarships back.
Okay.
That's great. And one of the things that helps when you have volunteers come in is then you get to know them, people doing work for their thing, you get to know them, and then they might find some more opportunities with us.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Becky, Michelle, did you have another question?
I do not. I just am slow to raise and lower my hand.
Thank you. Becky, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I was just wondering, so there's a lot of back and forth around fees or no fees for various trainings of various kinds. We of course still don't have a training director. But I love the model that you're introducing, which could have lots of different forms. Are you reintroducing us to, which it's not an either or, right? It's we're also have been working around a donation model. I'm also wondering if you have a sense, it sounds like volunteer coordination was really rolled into and central to your work and also various program director work. But at this point, we've grown much larger in many ways. I have to say we're doing many interesting things with volunteers as well, restorative circles and best starts for kids, peer mediations, and all kinds of. So I have to say, I think we're still doing lots of really interesting, wonderful things that we can build on that really builds on your legacy, Sue-Ann. So, but I guess I'm just kind of that whole accessibility in terms of financial and otherwise, the invite, feeling invited, and also retention of volunteers, and what any wisdom you might have from your experience of how we really retain volunteers and especially since so many work across programs. So just anything at all that you in that sort of realm, I'd be very interested to hear your perspective.
My experience is that, a lot of volunteers are looking for new ways to use their skills. So the more you can offer different things, so somebody came in as a conciliator. They eventually took mediation training. A lot of our conciliators didn't want to become mediators in the early days, but later most of them did. They took mediation training. They got involved with mediation. If there were training and facilitation and court, then they got to go to court. They could do a variety of things. And then eventually they could start getting paid for some things. Of course, I think foreclosure mediation was the only one that paid our mediators at that time. But training, if they were trainers, the ones who came into train and mediation training got stipend or some compensation anyway for that.
And
If they came in for conciliation training, they didn't, I don't think.
And stipends pretty early for the small claims court. Leads was another area.
Yep. And we never charged for conciliation training. That was, keeping our the conciliators were a lot cheaper than staff. So we trained them, and the people who came in to help with that didn't get paid to help put it on either, but they got experience doing it. And usually people who really were interested in training would start volunteering at conciliation training, and then they get to do something that got paid later. And I don't think it always needs to be paid opportunities, but at some level of skill, it does feel nice and affirming to be able to get some compensation. I guess that's the thing that I think, and just knowing they're valued. I don't know if there's any kind of volunteer recognition events these days or not. Probably during the pandemic there wouldn't have been. I mean, it'd be hard to get together in person anyway. But those kinds of things, I think I just see all the people on here who continue to develop skills and have developed skills, either starting with the DRC or starting it with something similar on another location. I want to thank the couple of people who put in the NAFCM, and it is, Sharon got it exactly right, National Association for Community Mediation. The F is for 4. Sue got it almost right, National Association of Community Mediation. I couldn't do this.
Are there any other questions?
I have one more.
Oh,
Becky's got me thinking about volunteers, and I'm wondering, in all that you described for us, I didn't hear of a position that was specifically a volunteer coordinator. How did you manage the flow of volunteers across different programs or projects?
Probably badly. I'm not sure. We didn't have we never had a volunteer coordinator. I think that might be a good idea. Even when we were smaller, it might have been a good idea. And as you're bigger, probably that would be helpful. We just talked to each other. I mean, there were only usually staff that ranged from 4 to, not counting court leads, 4 to 12 at the most people in the office. So we just talked to each other and tried to manage it. But I'm sure there were lots of gaps and people maybe who were conciliators or mediators who would have liked to have done training but never thought to approach me about it. We didn't have a structure. Do you want to be a trainer? Well, I did. At some points I offered training of trainers. Then that would invite people. But otherwise it was just, I might ask somebody, but usually people ask me, and if they didn't think of it, they might get missed.
And there was also
coordinator is a good idea.
I can speak to this. I got dropped off the family mediator list periodically over the years, and I would always wonder, is it me? And it would usually turn out to be, or I think almost always turn out to be, no, it was just a handoff of a list to someone or the other, or, so that, I think that happened to a lot of people. And I was able to reassure a lot of my colleagues to please contact somebody, because it's almost certainly not you, so yeah.
I think over the years we changed, we tried to put in place some standards, like you needed to mediate a certain number of times a year to stay on the list. So they might not tell you and you got dropped off. I don't know.
No, I met those standards.
Yeah. So computer glitch.
Yeah, it was not intentional, as it turned out every time, but I just wondered about my colleagues who might have not, or had other things, and they
didn't pursue it.
Yeah.
Wow. Sue Ann, you are a wealth of knowledge and a resource to this DRC. I mean, and something to be treasured. You are a King Dispute Resolution Center of King County treasurer.
Thank you.
And I am honored. I can't speak for everyone else, but it looks like we're all pretty honored, and everyone who showed up today really wanted to hear what you have to say, and we're all honored that you took the time to be with us. I hope this is the first of many and not the last. So thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to get to share some of that. And I am putting together some written things to turn into somebody who will file it somewhere.
Awesome. And I am happy to be that somebody. So now you at least know one person you include in the email. You can put me in the email, and I'm sure some other folks are raising their hands here. It would be like, you can put me in the email, and then it will get to the right place.
Well, Sharon, nice to see your face.
Yes. Thank you all
So
for
good to see
coming.
you. Thank you, Sue Ann. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Thank
Hope to
you,
see you
everyone.
all sometime soon.
Okay.
Have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you next week.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Sue
Have a good one,
Ann.
you guys.
Thanks for organizing it, Tony.
Oh, you all are welcome. This has been my heart is so full today. I gotta end the day now.
Good idea.
Quit while you're ahead.
Thank you. All right. It's just